Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that will make you look at your thermostat with a newfound respect. The utter, ridiculous paranoia of the medieval lord. We'll discover that the Roman high society banquet was less about drunken chaos and more about a calculated political power flex. And we'll learn that for Vikings, a tattoo wasn't a spontaneous holiday decision, but a literal map of their soul. So before we dive into the dark, twisty secrets of a 1,000-year-old castle staircase, the awkward social politics of a Roman feast, and the last stand of an Illyrian king, take a moment to get comfortable. Lie back, breathe gently, and let that day you just melt away. Please feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe put a pillow under your head for that perfect support. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Have you ever wondered what the plumbing situation was like in a 1,000-year-old stone castle? Was it just a hole in the floor? And was the first castle really just a hastily built wooden shed on a gigantic dirt pile? If you received a dinner invitation to a Roman elite's house, were you expected to be drunk and vomiting? Or was that just bad PR from later writers? And for a Viking woman, was getting a tattoo more solemn than a wedding? A permanent, painful map of her entire life? These people weren't living for comfort. They were living for survival, for social status, and for paranoia. Every stone, every rune, and every dinner course was a strategic choice. Tonight, we're going to pull back the portcullis on their deepest fears and wildest ambitions. So congratulations. You've just woken up around the year 1100 AD. You're an up-and-coming nobleman, and you are about to build your first castle. Get ready for the architectural equivalent of a midlife crisis. Chapter 1. The First Castle. An architectural apology. You've just been handed the keys to your new home, a towering, magnificent structure that screams wealth and permanent power. But before the first stone could be laid, your new medieval neighborhood looked a lot less like a postcard and a lot more like a poorly designed kindergarten project. It was the era of the rough, ready, and frankly embarrassing Motte and Bailey Castle. This Motte and Bailey design, which emerged in Europe from the 10th century onwards, was the starter castle of the Middle Ages. It was quick, relatively cheap, and perfectly captured the anxiety of the early feudal lord, powerful enough to defend, but temporary enough to suggest you hadn't fully committed yet. Imagine the architectural vision. A wooden or stone keep perched on a raised earthwork, the motte, adjacent to a protected courtyard, the bailey. It sounds grand, but for a new feudal lord, this structure was more about securing a quick foothold than building an eternal monument. When the Normans introduced it to England and Wales after the 1066 invasion, they didn't have time for 10-year stone projects. They needed immediate, frightening presence. This was instant power, delivered in a pile of dirt and a few hundred logs. It was the absolute quickest way to establish a new, overwhelming authority over a freshly conquered or newly acquired territory, like setting up a very loud, very armed pop-up shop. The overall feeling of the Motte and Bailey was one of brutal functionality. It was never intended to be comfortable. The point was defensive efficiency, not open-plan living. The whole site was surrounded by a protective ditch and palisade to slow down any uninvited guests, making the entire compound look less like a majestic manor and more like a very serious, very muddy construction site. It was a design born of necessity, not luxury, and it served its purpose well by requiring little skilled labor, making it an attractive proposition for lords who could use forced peasant labor. You, the new lord, might be sipping weak wine in your wooden keep, but you'd be acutely aware that your magnificent domain was just a few torches and a strong wind away from becoming a very large bonfire. It was the architectural equivalent of buying a reliable, slightly rusty pickup truck instead of a sports car. It gets the job done, but it doesn't impress anyone who matters. But don't worry. The next step, the dirt mountain, is where the real exhausting fun begins. Now, let's talk about the two halves of this whole situation, the motte and the bailey. Think of it like a medieval mullet. Business in the bailey, party on the motte. Except the party is incredibly stressful and damp. The bailey, the large flat courtyard at the base of the mound, was the engine room of the entire operation. This was the bustling, chaotic, and incredibly smelly heart of your new fiefdom. In here, you had stables for your essential terrifying, war horses, blacksmiths hammering out swords and hinges, carpenters sawing wood for repairs, which were constant, and storage for all your food, grain, and weaponry. It was a functional, noisy, and muddy hub, where the vast majority of your people, servants, soldiers, and specialized craftsmen actually lived and worked. The bailey was secured by its own perimeter of a timber palisade, a rough, tall fence made of sharpened logs, backed by an outer ditch, offering initial protection against opportunist raiders. If the enemy was small or just curious, the bailey could handle it. If the enemy was organized and angry, you quickly retreated to the high ground. But the motte. The motte was the VIP section. It was the massive artificial earth mound, a looming hill that made your wooden keep look absolutely formidable. This was the final desperate refuge, the most defensible spot, and the psychological centerpiece of the whole structure. Ascending the motte was intentionally difficult, a steep, slippery climb, often by way of a narrow staircase or ramp that could easily be dismantled under attack. The wooden keep or tower at the top was not a great palace. It was small, cramped, and built purely to serve as a lookout point and a last-ditch fighting platform. It was a glorified armed log cabin, strategically placed to maximize the advantage of height, ensuring the lord was literally above everyone else, politically and geographically. The genius of the motte and bailey was its speed and adaptability. You could build the entire structure, dirt mound and wooden fences, in a matter of months, which was revolutionary compared to the decade it might take to build a stone castle. This rapid deployment was crucial for conquerors like the Normans, allowing them to instantly impose their authority across a vast hostile territory. But this speed came with constant, nagging downsides. The wooden structures suffered from rapid decay, forcing continuous maintenance against rot and weather. And as previously mentioned, they were terrifyingly vulnerable to fire. One well-aimed flaming arrow, or a determined arsonist, could turn your entire power base into a smoking ruin in an afternoon. Imagine the anxiety every single time a strong gust of wind hit the timber walls. It was a constant, low-grade thrum of architectural panic. Yet, despite its flaws, The Mott and Bailey was a profound statement of change. It was the new language of power, replacing the older, less fortified manners of the previous regime. It was a blunt, aggressive, and highly effective symbol of a new, organized feudal system taking root. So as you look out from your temporary wooden tower, sipping your unheated mead, you are looking out over a kingdom that knows exactly who's in charge now. You might be cold, you might be drafty, and you might be worried about termites, but you are also unequivocally the boss. Now, let's figure out how your peasants managed to pile up this gigantic hill in the first place. Chapter 2. The Art of the Dirt Mountain. The first essential step in becoming a self-respecting medieval lord was the construction of the motte, the massive, steep dirt hill upon which your whole sense of self-worth would literally sit. Forget about bulldozers or structural engineers. This was a colossal mound of earth, painstakingly piled up by disposable laborers, whose main job was to ensure your fortress was tall enough to look down on your neighbors. This isn't just a mound of dirt, it's a statement. It's a statement that says, I have enough spare peasants to move a literal hill just to make a point. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering, a testament to the fact that human labor in the Middle Ages was virtually limitless. The largest mottes, such as the one at Thetford, are estimated to have required up to 24,000 man-days of work. Even smaller ones demanded about 1,000 man-days, which is still a massive undertaking for a simple dirt platform. The motte building was performed entirely by hand, using primitive tools like wooden shovels and hand barrows, perhaps supplemented by picks in later periods. Imagine the logistical nightmare of hauling all that earth, shovelful by shovelful, to create an artificial hill that could reach heights of 100 feet or more. This construction process was highly labor-intensive, but required very little specialized skill, making it perfect for using the forced, unskilled labor of the local, recently conquered peasantry. It was a brutally effective way to introduce a new lord to his new subjects. Welcome. Now move that mountain. Historians estimate that a larger motte could take between 4 and 9 months to complete, contrasting sharply with the up to 10 years it might take to build a contemporary stone keep. This speed was the genius of the motte design. It gave you a formidable military presence fast, ensuring that your new territory was secured before anyone could rally a counterattack. It was a rapid imposition of control, a visible, screaming declaration of the new power structure. The quick construction was also important because the motte wasn't just decorative, it was highly functional. The steep sides and height made it an immediate and potent defensive position, difficult to scale, and perfectly placed to provide a dominant field of fire for your archers. It was less a hill and more a vertical barrier of inconvenience. But building a motte was a constant battle against physics and nature. You couldn't just pile up loose dirt. The mound had to be compacted, layer by layer, to ensure it was stable enough to hold the wooden or stone keep on top. A motte built too quickly or improperly would inevitably slump, settle, or erode, leading to serious structural issues or, worst-case scenario, the collapse of your wooden tower. There were cases where mottes were built on unsuitable, soft ground, leading to decades of miserable repairs and chronic instability. For the engineers and laborers, wasn't just digging. It was an exercise in primitive geoengineering, conducted under immense time pressure and the threat of the Lord's displeasure. The psychological impact of this construction project cannot be overstated. As the mound rose, it was a visible, undeniable display of your new feudal authority. You were literally changing the landscape to reflect your power. The people forced to build it, often the local peasantry, were reminded daily of their new subservience. It was a back-breaking project, a monument to their enforced labor, and a chilling sign that the days of their old lords were over. The motte building became a physical and social spectacle. Imagine the sheer visibility of this enormous worksite. It couldn't be ignored, and it spoke volumes about the new order. Obedience, labor, and hierarchy. This dirt mountain wasn't an inconvenience. It was the foundation of your entire social and military life, and its successful completion meant the first major victory in securing your new territory. It was the architectural equivalent of throwing down a gauntlet made of several tons of finely compacted earth. Now that you've built the world's most impressive dirt pile, you need to cap it off with a spectacular wooden house. Chapter 3: Sticks, Mud, and Feudal Grandeur. Perched precariously atop your new dirt mountain was the original castle itself, a rough wooden fort enclosed by a timber palisade. This early design, known as the motte and bailey, was less a symbol of enduring authority and more a temporary architectural apology, vulnerable to high winds, fire, and a threatening sky. The actual wooden keep on the motte was the lord's final refuge, small and cramped, offering a last desperate line of defense if the bailey fell. It was, generously speaking, a slightly fortified, overly exposed log cabin. The timber walls, while quickly constructed, were terribly vulnerable to the constant medieval threats of fire and decay. The wooden architecture of the keep presented a paradox. It was quick to erect, but a constant headache to maintain. The heavy oak or other sturdy wood required massive resources to acquire and shape, yet it was susceptible to rot, insect infestation, and, most terrifyingly, fire. A flaming arrow could swiftly turn the lord's home into a raging beacon, giving the occupants a terrifying choice: burn alive or jump from the height of the motte. For you, the lord, every time a cook lit the hearth or a strong gust of wind rattled the timber, a knot of anxiety tightened in your stomach. It was a life lived under the constant, low-grade thrum of architectural panic. Meanwhile, the bailey at the base was where the real-life chaos unfolded. This wide, flat courtyard was surrounded by a wooden palisade, a tall fence of sharpened logs, and it was perpetually muddy, noisy, and pungent. Here was the essential chaos of feudal life. The stables, where the precious war horses were kept. A war horse was easily worth 10 peasants. The blacksmith hammering out tools and weapons 24/7. The communal kitchens, perpetually smoking and busy. The barracks for your garrison of soldiers, and large storehouses crammed with grain, salted meat, and ale. The bailey was your logistics center, and its security was paramount, as losing it meant losing the capacity to feed and equip your men during a siege. It was a muddy, working ecosystem designed for pure, brutal efficiency. The vulnerability of the wood meant that even without a siege, life inside the keep was a constant battle against the elements. The timber walls were not great insulators, leading to perpetual drafts and cold, especially in winter. The roof, usually made of thatch or wooden shingles, required constant repair against leaks. A medieval lord, supposedly living in the pinnacle of luxury and power, was actually enduring a lifestyle that felt more like a glorified armed camping trip. The difference between a peaceful night and a defensive nightmare could hinge on something as simple as a broken palisade plank or a poorly banked fire. The Motte and Bailey structure also presented an inherent vulnerability of division. If the bailey was breached, the people, supplies, and animals within were exposed, forcing them desperate retreat up the motte. Once sealed inside the tiny wooden keep, the lord and his small retinue were completely cut off, essentially hostages in their own final refuge. This division meant the attackers only had to win 2 battles, the courtyard and the hill, and given the fragility of the wooden structure, a focused attack on the keep with fire, once the bailey had fallen, often led to a swift and tragic end. The Motte and Bailey Castle was a testament to the fact that while the Normans were brilliant military strategists, their early architecture was still a work in progress, a powerful but deeply flawed symbol of their new aggressive dominion. You were safe, yes, but you were constantly, acutely aware of how quickly that safety could turn into smoke and ash. Chapter 4. The Stone Castle Renaissance. You've had a few close calls with flaming arrows and the structural integrity of a wooden fence, and you've decided enough is enough. Welcome to the Stone Castle Revolution, a magnificent era when thousands of new keeps, stark and functional with their tiny defensive windows, began to grimly announce the start of a new, permanent feudal authority across the English landscape. This shift from temporary wood and dirt to permanent stone represented an entirely new level of commitment, money, and power. It was the architectural declaration that you and your lineage were here to stay, a literal, physical marker that you were done with fire hazards and constantly having to replace rotten palisade logs. Building a large stone castle was a monumentally expensive undertaking. This wasn't just a financial choice, it was an act of national-level economic mobilization. King Edward I, for example, nearly bankrupted the royal treasuries, spending approximately £100,000 on his castles in Wales alone, a staggering sum for the time. To put that in perspective, a single huge castle in the Middle Ages could cost the equivalent of an entire year's tax revenue for a country. This was not a project for a casual lord. This was a statement reserved for the wealthiest nobles or the crown itself, a profound flex of dynastic wealth. The construction cost ensured that a stone castle was a permanent fixture, a structure designed to outlast generations, not just a few rainstorms. Construction times were also dramatically longer than the quick Motte and Bailey. Stone keeps typically took up to 10 years to build, with some castles requiring between 2 and 10 years, depending on the size and complexity. This meant tying up massive amounts of capital, labor, and resources for a decade or more. The sheer effort was immense. The construction effort itself was a huge mobilization of resources, employing about 3,000 workers, including highly specialized masons, carpenters, diggers, quarrymen, and blacksmiths, all working under the direction of a master builder. Masons in particular were the rock stars of the medieval world, highly paid and highly skilled, their knowledge of stone cutting, vaulting, and engineering being the crucial difference between a strong fortress and a pile of rubble. The stone walls once raised were practically impervious to fire and incredibly resistant to siege weapons like battering rams and trebuchets, giving the inhabitants a profound sense of security unmatched by their wooden predecessors. This massive stone barrier, sometimes dozens of feet thick, could absorb punishment that would shatter any wooden defense, allowing the Lord to sleep soundly, or at least more soundly, knowing that his structural integrity was no longer dependent on the lucky breeze or the vigilance of a peasant with a bucket of water. However, the advantages of stone came with brutal trade-offs. The first and most immediate was comfort. The tiny windows, or arrow slits, were a defensive necessity, designed to let an arrow out, but not an attacker in, turning the interior into a perpetually dim, cold, and echoing space. Imagine trading your bright, if flammable, wooden home for a life inside a giant, slightly damp refrigerator. Stone, while strong, is a terrible insulator, and the massive walls retained the outside cold, radiating it inward. The interior of the keep was a world of drafts, perpetual cold, and a constant low-grade humidity that seemed to settle in your bones. The great halls, while impressive, were difficult to heat, relying on massive fireplaces that only truly warmed the immediate vicinity. You learned to live within the tiny cone of heat projected by the hearth, with the rest of the room shrouded in perpetual winter. The sheer logistical challenge of building these stone behemoths also contributed to their grim atmosphere. Since transport was done entirely by draft animals and human labor, securing local quarrying sites was crucial. If suitable stone wasn't nearby, the cost and time involved in hauling material over long, unpaved medieval roads increased exponentially. The site itself became a noisy, dangerous, and chaotic hub of activity for years, a constant reminder that your magnificence was being built on the backs of thousands of laborers, many of whom were forced into service or worked for meager wages. The final product was a fortress designed to be an active military machine. Every feature served a purpose: the high curtain walls, the outer defensive ring, with their crenellations, the up and down pattern of the battlements, provided cover for archers. The towers offered flanking fire along the length of the walls, and the central keep was the ultimate, last-ditch holdout. The stark, intimidating look of these stone structures perfectly reflected the hard, uncompromising nature of the feudal authority they represented. The stone castle was not built to host lavish parties, though it did, or to make the lord comfortable. It was built to survive, to intimidate, and to last for generations. Living in a stone castle was a life of cold, draughts, and darkness, but every bit of discomfort was a silent, powerful reassurance that you were safe, and your power was now literally set in stone. It was the ultimate architectural flex, purchased at the cost of warmth and natural light. Chapter 5. The Unpaid Bodyguard of Gravity. The first and cheapest line of defense for your new stone fortress was location, location, location. Why pay extra guards when you can get gravity to work for you for free? Your colossal castle sits atop a steep, miserable hill, ensuring that any advancing attacker begins the grueling climb by losing both breath and dignity long before they even see your main gate. This is medieval military strategy at its finest, exploiting the natural terrain to enhance your man-made defenses. The ideal castle site was on a rocky outcrop, a massive hill, or a strategic bend in a river, using geography to compound the attacker's misery. The advantage of height is multifaceted, making the hill the unsung hero of your castle's defense. First, it compels a slow upward climb, exhausting men in heavy armor long before the engagement begins. An attacker wearing 50 to 80 pounds of steel armor on a rocky, uneven slope is quickly depleted of energy, making them slower, less accurate, and highly susceptible to heat exhaustion. The steep incline makes a disciplined, synchronized charge virtually impossible. The attackers arrive winded, disorganized, and already questioning their commitment to the siege. It's a victory achieved entirely by the ground itself. Second, the height provides a massive gravitational advantage to the defenders, turning even the simplest items into deadly projectiles. Everything from falling stones to discarded timbers gains significant momentum on the way down, making it far more deadly than if thrown horizontally. And while later castles featured elaborate machicolations for dropping large rocks, the simple fact is that anything pushed off the battlements will be accelerated down the steep slope. Even if you're out of ammunition, you can resort to throwing things you don't want anymore, transforming medieval refuse into a form of projectile warfare. You've essentially weaponized the entire hillside. Third, the steep angle makes it virtually impossible for attackers to effectively use siege towers or heavy battering rams, which require relatively flat, stable ground for maneuverability and operation. Rolling a gigantic wooden tower up a 45-degree angle of loose rock simply isn't feasible. This lack of access forces the enemy to resort to less effective, riskier tactics, such as undermining the walls, sapping, or tedious, prolonged bombardment, both of which allow you, the defender, more time to plan and receive reinforcements. Furthermore, building on a natural rock foundation provided superior structural stability compared to the man-made dirt mounds of the Motte and Bailey era. Your stone keep was less likely to shift, settle, or slump over time, ensuring that the years of construction weren't wasted on a structurally unsound foundation. This solid bedrock was crucial for anchoring the heavy, deep foundations needed for massive stone walls, ensuring the castle could withstand centuries of weather and warfare. For the attacker, the ascent was a guaranteed nightmare. Not only were they facing a climb that could easily be compared to running a marathon uphill while wearing a refrigerator, but they were doing so while exposed to a constant, disciplined hail of arrows and crossbow bolts from the high, safe battlements. The defenders' energy expenditure was minimal. They merely had to reload and aim downward, taking advantage of the static, slow-moving targets below. The attacker's exhaustion, exposure, and difficulty of approach made the hill the single most effective and cheapest defensive element you could possibly ask for. The hill wasn't just a place to build. It was a preemptive psychological weapon that eroded the enemy's will to fight before the first true blow was struck. It's the ultimate expression of lazy, brilliant defense, letting the landscape do the heavy lifting, while you simply stood back and maintained your superiority. Chapter 6. Aesthetics over Amenities. In the grand theater of medieval power, it wasn't enough for your castle to be merely functional. It had to scream magnificence and sheer aesthetic domination. Sometimes this meant prioritizing the wow factor over petty concerns like, fresh water. A truly magnificent stone castle might be clinging precariously to a misty cliff edge, overlooking a terrifying, dramatic bog, not because it's the most defensible spot, but because it looks like absolute, terrifying power. This is the difference between a simple fortress and a statement fortress. This focus on showing power, rather than just having it, was a crucial part of the feudal contract. The castle was the lord's personal billboard, announcing his wealth, his lineage, and his ability to command the resources required to build such a stunning, difficult structure. The magnificent masonry was not just protection, it was conspicuous consumption. Every carved stone and every towering curtain wall served as a permanent, undeniable reminder to the surrounding peasantry and rival nobles, this is my land, and I am superior. The sheer scale and intricate work were an intimidating display of social status and paranoid wealth, a visual argument for why you, specifically, deserved to rule. However, choosing a spectacular location often came with massive logistical headaches that ensured the lord was perpetually uncomfortable. Building a castle on a sheer cliff or rocky spire meant that all materials, every block of stone, every barrel of cement, every piece of timber, had to be hauled uphill by brute force. This required building temporary access roads, ramps, and using primitive winches and pulleys, multiplying the time and labor involved in construction. If you prioritized a view over a nearby easy-to-access fresh water source, like a spring or well at the base of the hill, you then faced the daily, year-round misery of hauling water uphill from the distant river or bog. This chore took considerable manpower and energy away from other important tasks, and was a significant vulnerability during a siege, as the enemy only needed to secure the bottom of the hill to choke off your supply. Furthermore, these exposed cliffside locations were often subject to brutal, unrelenting winds and damp, perpetual fog, ensuring that the interior was constantly cold, damp, and uncomfortable. The stone walls, being thick but uninsulated, acted as huge thermal masses, radiating cold into the interior during winter and keeping the air perpetually clammy. Imagine the endless battle against mold, mildew, and structural dampness. You, the lord, may have a breathtaking view of the valley from your solarium, private chambers, but you're probably also fighting a permanent case of the sniffles, and your tapestry collection is constantly at risk of decay. The castle became a beautiful paradox, a symbol of untouchable power that delivered a life of constant minor misery. The vast, echoing great halls were nearly impossible to keep warm, forcing people to crowd around the large central hearths, resulting in smoky air and uneven heating. One side of your body might be roasting, while the other was actively freezing. Privacy was non-existent. The hall was a noisy communal space, a far cry from the quiet solitude implied by the castle's isolated location. Yet the lord endured it all. He put up with the drafts, the cold, the smell of damp stone, and the logistical nightmare, all because that terrifying, dramatic silhouette on the misty cliff edge made the ultimate statement. My fear and my ego are bigger than my need for comfort. You're living inside a glorious, dramatic, and perpetually drafty monument to your own ego. Chapter 7. The Psychological Warfare of the Moat. Let's move past the dramatic, drafty cliff edge and address the actual, immediate, and utterly foul defensive reality that awaits any aggressor. Before any invader could lay a hand on your magnificent masonry, they had to contend with the humble but brutally effective moat. This wide, filthy trench surrounding your castle walls wasn't a pristine, decorative canal. It was a psychological weapon, filled with stagnant water, mud, and a foul, pungent smell, designed to kill an attacker's morale before you even had to lift a crossbow. The moat served three key, equally miserable functions, making it far more than just a big ditch. First, it was a physical obstacle, forcing attackers to carry cumbersome scaling ladders or siege equipment across the water and mud, making them slow, exposed targets. The width of the moat ensured that even a well-aimed jump was a fool's errand, and any attempt to fill it quickly with rocks or debris was met with a deadly hail of fire from the battlements. The sheer angle of the far bank, often steep and slick with mud, meant that even reaching the stone wall was a desperate, energy-sapping struggle. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the moat was an essential excavation source. The earth dug out to create the moat was often used to form an earthen bank or rampart outside the main wall, known as a glacis or counterscarp, further increasing the height and angle an attacker would have to clear. This meant every bucket of dirt dug out made your castle more defensible. The moat wasn't a separate feature. It was part of a dynamic, mutually reinforcing defensive system. You used the earth you removed to literally build a higher barrier, transforming the negative space into an active defense. It's brilliant, cost-effective landscaping that also happens to kill people. But third, and most viscerally, was the filth. Moats were not cleaned, aerated, or maintained for aesthetics. They were left to fill with rainwater, stagnant runoff, mud, and often the castle's own waste. While popular legend suggests they were actively filled with human sewage to create a biological weapon, the reality is simpler and far more disgusting. The water became a putrid, stagnant biohazard naturally. The thick layer of sludge, a murky, unsanitary cocktail of mud, decay, and who knows what, was a major deterrent. The smell alone, that unholy aroma of marsh gas, sewage, and decomposing organic matter, was enough to make a seasoned mercenary reconsider his life choices. Imagine trying to breathe deeply before a major assault, while standing on the edge of the world's largest open sewer. It was a psychological barrier that eroded the will to fight. An invader who successfully managed to wade or swim across would emerge smelling horrendous, covered in filth, shivering, and immediately at risk of disease and infection. Medieval medicine being what it was, a simple cut from crossing the moat could lead to a far more debilitating and often lethal infection than any arrow wound. Their armor, now heavy with mud and water, would chafe and restrict movement, making the final assault a physical agony. It's the ultimate psychological barrier, an unholy mixture of medieval sewage and mud that turns the act of simply approaching the castle into a miserable, potentially lethal proposition. Forget fire and steel. The greatest weapon might have been the smell of the unaerated, mud-filled trench itself. It was a silent, smelly promise of the misery that awaited anyone foolish enough to get closer. The moat was truly the cheapest, smelliest form of germ warfare the Middle Ages had to offer, proving that sometimes the simplest defenses are the most brutally effective. It makes your modern worries about forgetting to take out the trash seem positively serene by comparison. Now, if they somehow manage to survive the swampy, pungent baptism, they have to face the next stage, the corridor of maximum regret. Chapter 8. The Gatehouse of Maximum Regret. If an invading force manages to cross your foul moat and the rickety drawbridge, they enter the belly of the beast, the gatehouse tunnel, a corridor designed for maximum regret. This complex stone hallway wasn't just an entrance. It was a multi-layered death trap, a narrow, unforgiving choke point that funneled attackers into a predetermined zone of slaughter. The gatehouse was the single most elaborate and costly piece of a medieval castle's defense, essentially a small, self-contained fortress within the main walls, a highly weaponized welcoming mat. As the attackers rush in, thinking they've breached the main defense, they cross the drawbridge, which itself is often designed with a crucial flaw, a gap or pit immediately in front of the gate, so that if the bridge is dropped too quickly, any approaching soldier is plunged into a ditch. Once past that, they enter the gloomy, echoing stone tunnel. Immediately, the elaborate trap is sprung. A massive portcullis, a heavy vertically sliding wooden or iron grill, is quickly dropped behind them with a terrible resonant clang, sealing the entrance. This is the sound of hope evaporating. Immediately after, a second portcullis or reinforced wooden door slams shut in front of them, sealing the attackers in a stone hallway known as the Killing Ground or Corridor of Death. They are now trapped in a space that is too narrow to turn around, too dark to see clearly, and perfectly engineered for their demise. Once trapped, the real fun begins. The walls and ceilings of the tunnel are riddled with small openings and terrifyingly effective features. From murder holes, meurtrières, in the ceiling, the defenders could rain down a polite hail of arrows, crossbow bolts, boiling water, hot sand, or heavy stones onto the packed crowd below. The murder holes were carefully angled to maximize coverage of the confined space. Attackers, packed shoulder to shoulder in the narrow passage, couldn't swing their weapons effectively, and their large shields were useless against an attack coming from directly above. They couldn't advance, retreat was impossible, and the cramped, sudden darkness amplified the panic and chaos. The defenders were operating in a controlled environment, calmly executing the kill sequence. The heat from the boiling water, or the searing pain of hot sand, which can seep through armor much better than liquid, would cause immense suffering. The noise, the screams, the clang of falling portcullises, the thud of rocks, would be deafening and deeply demoralizing. This stone hallway became a medieval meat grinder, a short, brutal lesson in why you never rush through a castle's front door. To add to the misery, sometimes the gatehouse included internal guard rooms from which defenders could fire directly into the corridor through narrow, protected slits, creating a deadly crossfire. The attacker was not just fighting the castle, he was fighting the very color, architecture of the space, which was designed to render his armor and weapons useless. Think of it as a poorly attended, very narrow rock concert, where the crowd surfing has been replaced with boiling water. You've broken into the castle, congratulations, but you've done so directly into the enemy's perfectly executed stone-built punchline. The gatehouse wasn't just a part of the castle. It was a stone-built guarantee that any successful breach of the outer defenses would immediately lead to maximum regret for the invaders. You are left standing in the dark, cold stone, waiting for the inevitable to drop from above. Chapter 9. The Clockwise Conundrum. You've somehow survived the moat, the gatehouse, and the gauntlet of human regret, and now you face the final challenge. Climbing the tower's interior staircase. What you might not realize, as you hoist your weary body and heavy armor up the slick stone, is that the narrow, uneven stone stairs twist upward in a clever clockwise spiral. This tiny architectural detail is a brilliant piece of cost-effective defensive engineering, turning a simple staircase into a massive, strategic advantage for the defenders. For a right-handed attacker, and the vast majority of medieval soldiers were right-handed, the clockwise spiral is a brutal, disabling handicap. As you climb, the central newel post or column of the staircase is positioned on your right side. This central pillar completely obstructs your ability to take a full, powerful, sweeping swing with your sword or axe, forcing you to use short, awkward jabs, or worse, expose yourself entirely as you try to switch hands to your weaker side. Your most powerful, dominant weapon arm is constantly hitting stone, robbing your attack of force and reach. In contrast, the defender, standing above you and descending, has the newel post on their left. This leaves their dominant right arm completely free to swing downward in a full, unimpeded arc, creating a clear, dramatic advantage at every single step. It's a silent, brilliant feature that exploits the fundamental biomechanics of the human body. The defender is fighting on a clear field of fire, while the attacker is fighting himself and the architecture simultaneously. It's the medieval equivalent of walking up a spiral staircase while carrying a very long umbrella, with someone perfectly positioned above you to hit you with a golf club. To make matters worse, these stairs were often deliberately narrow, uneven, and strategically low-ceilinged. The narrowness forced attackers into single file, nullifying the power of a large unit and turning the climb into a series of one-on-one duels. The steps themselves were rarely uniform. They were often built with uneven risers and treads, a subtle tripping hazard for anyone not intimately familiar with the tower's rhythm. An attacker, wearing 70 pounds of armor and rushing up in the dim light, was almost guaranteed to stumble or lose their footing, presenting a perfect opening for the defender above. The low ceiling, designed to save stone, often forced attackers to crouch or stoop, exposing the unprotected back of the neck or the head to a descending blow. The whole climb was designed to be a claustrophobic, dark, and physically taxing misery. The stone was often slick with dampness, or, in the heat of a siege, perhaps something worse. The noise of steel on stone, the echoing footsteps, and the lack of light created a disorienting, terrifying atmosphere. The staircase wasn't just a way to move from floor to floor. It was a continuous, exhausting, and deeply biased killing zone that favored the man who designed it. You are not simply ascending. You are engaging in a difficult, claustrophobic duel against a defender who is playing on home turf, with the rulebook, the very design of the space, stacked unfairly in their favor. This clever architectural feature used basic physiology as a free, permanent bodyguard, ensuring that the last line of defense was both subtle and brutally effective. Chapter 10. The Lord's Paranoid Masterpiece. Finally, a wealthy lord stands on his towering battlements, surveying his newly fortified domain. This magnificent stone structure, 1,000 times stronger than the old wooden fort, is an undeniable, carved expression of his high social status. It is a masterpiece built for an audience. But at its heart, a castle is nothing more than a magnificent monument to one man's paranoid wealth and fear. The entire defensive system, the moat, the steep hill, the filthy moat, the killing ground gatehouse, and the twisty stairs, is not about keeping people out indefinitely. It's about buying time. The medieval lord understood a brutal truth. A truly determined army with enough resources and time could breach almost any defense. The real underlying value of the castle lay in its ability to delay the inevitable until reinforcements could arrive, until the besieging force ran out of supplies, or until they simply lost the will to continue the incredibly expensive and tedious work of a medieval siege. The towering keep, with its stone-hard permanence, sent an unmistakable signal. I am rich, I am powerful, and I am prepared to sit here for 6 months eating dried beans until you all go home. This projection of unflinching endurance was the true purpose of the castle. It was an enormous, decade-long investment in pure, aggressive inertia. It was a billion-dollar insurance policy against the chaos of the medieval world, purchased with the labor of thousands of peasants and the perpetual anxiety of the lord. This meant the lord's life was an exercise in magnificent isolation. He had built the safest place in the world, yet he lived in a state of constant, low-grade vigilance. His private chambers, the solarium, while better appointed than the rest of the keep, were still cold, dark, and often smelled faintly of smoke, damp stone, and unwashed men. The tiny high windows limited the view of the world outside, creating a sense of claustrophobic security. You were protected from the arrow, but you were constantly oppressed by the architecture itself. The sound inside a stone castle was a strange, echoing wash of noise, a constant drip of water, the distant clatter of the kitchen, the unsettling resonance of footsteps on stone, and the unnerving whistle of the wind through arrow slits. Genuine peace and quiet simply did not exist. Your entire daily life was dictated by military architecture. You learned to navigate the narrow, dark passageways, the slick, uneven steps, and the general humidity that clung to everything. Even the great hall, the center of social life, was an acoustic nightmare, a huge echoing space that swallowed conversation and was almost impossible to heat, forcing everyone to cluster around the fire like damp medieval penguins. But you endured it all because the moment you stepped onto the battlements and looked out over your domain, you felt the satisfying shift from vulnerable wooden fort to unbreakable stone icon. This feeling of supreme security, of being able to weather any storm, was worth every single frozen night, every damp stone, and every penny spent on its construction. The castle was your legacy, your insurance policy, and your most potent weapon. A masterpiece of aggressive isolation, ensuring that the only thing louder than the wind was the silent, terrifying message of your enduring power. Chapter 11. The Subtlety of Roman Negotiation. Let's change gears entirely and move 800 years and a continent away to the sizzling sophistication of ancient Rome. Welcome to the heart of Roman high society, the triclinium, or formal dining room. Forget the images of wild debauchery. This is where the real work of empire gets done. Wine may flow, and music may play as the elites recline on silk cushions, but beneath the surface, your guests are engaged in intense political negotiation and subtle, calculated conversation. Dining was the defining ritual in Roman domestic life, often lasting from late afternoon until late at night, making it the primary theater for social and political advancement. The room itself, the triclinium, named for the three clini or couches, was a carefully staged environment, designed for maximum visibility and status demonstration. The guests, usually an intimate number of 9 to 20 people, would recline on their left side on these horseshoe-shaped couches arranged around a low square table, while household slaves served multiple courses from the kulina, kitchen. You didn't just sit, you reclined, a posture that signaled your elite status and leisure, proving you had the time and the slaves to support such elegant indolence. This intimate, static, and privileged space was often decorated with elaborate paintings, mosaics, and complex perspective scenes. Popular themes included Dionysus, Venus, or still lives of food, all designed to reflect and enhance the owner's prestige and status. The entire atmosphere was designed to be culturally public, even though it was physically private. You were in the host's home, but you were still performing for an audience. Crucially, seating order was prescribed and not random. Guests were arranged in a rigid hierarchy to emphasize divisions in status and relative closeness to the dominus or host. Being placed on the most important couch, particularly the place of honor, or locus consularis, was a public declaration of your political standing and the host's favor. If you were seated on the least important seat, you knew you had been subtly but publicly demoted. This dinner was not about filling your stomach. It was about gaining or losing political capital. You had to be constantly vigilant, subtly praising your host's latest military victory, offering carefully veiled criticisms of a rival absent from the table, all while ensuring your own comportment reflected the highest standards of Roman gravitas, dignity. The conversation was a masterpiece of controlled ambiguity. You couldn't just blurt out your political demands. You had to weave them into compliments about the wine or observations about the entertainment. The host, meanwhile, used the food and drink to subtly advertise his urbanitas, sophistication, and global power. The triclinium was a setting for theatricalized domestic space, where the drama of political maneuvering was performed under the guise of luxurious leisure. It was a dinner party that demanded the same focus as a Senate debate, a place where a casual slip of the tongue could end your career. Chapter 12. The Grandeur of Imperial Insanity. Let's turn the dial up on the Roman feast. Imagine yourself at Emperor Caligula's table, where opulence is a matter of life and death. Gilded ceilings and fountains flowing with wine create a scene of excessive luxury, but every rare delicacy and every glass is a carefully orchestrated reminder of the emperor's divine authority and your complete subservience to it. This takes the political theater of the triclinium and cranks the stakes up to a terrifying degree. Caligula, or any other tyrannical emperor, used the banquet as a stage to solidify and legitimize his new ideological principles and imperial power. The sheer, overwhelming excessive luxury was a deliberate, weaponized choice, signaling that the emperor had access to resources far beyond any senator or private citizen. This wasn't just dinner. It was an act of economic and cultural domination. The menu would feature staggering rarities, dishes designed to shock and awe. Think pheasant tongues, imported exotic seafood shipped across the Mediterranean at insane cost, and sauces prepared with spices gathered from the farthest corners of the known world, all designed to make the guests feel both awed and inadequate. The whole point was to put you on edge constantly. The sheer grandeur was meant to displace the memory of the Roman Republic's traditional values with a new, terrifying understanding. The emperor is supreme, and you are nothing. What earlier generations of Romans had seen as dangerous and immoral luxury had now become politically necessary, a demonstration of the emperor's godlike status. In this environment, you couldn't simply enjoy the food. Every word spoken, every gesture made, was scrutinized by the emperor and his inner circle, perhaps even by the emperor himself, whose capricious mood was the most terrifying element of the feast. Your forced enjoyment of the spectacle, the dancers, the singers, the over-the-top decor, and the sheer volume of wealth, was a public, undeniable confession of your loyalty and subservience. You might be forced to endure a lengthy, self-aggrandizing speech about the emperor's latest divine decree while your perfectly prepared exotic eel gets cold. The atmosphere was a blend of terror and forced adoration. You're reclining on silk, eating a delicacy that costs more than a common laborer makes in a lifetime, all while wondering if your slightly too slow nod of appreciation 5 minutes ago just earned you a one-way trip to exile or execution. The sheer unpredictability was the final touch of the terror. Unlike the formal Republican banquet, the imperial feast could descend into chaos at the emperor's whim. Guests might be publicly humiliated, forced to engage in bizarre games, or suddenly removed from the table entirely. This guaranteed that genuine relaxation was impossible. You were a performer on the emperor's stage, and your role was to demonstrate complete, ecstatic approval of his divine status and his insane spectacle. It's the ultimate lesson in imperial style over substance, where appearances and obedience were the only currency that mattered. And the food, no matter how rare, tasted like fear. Chapter 13. The Theatrics of Terror. The Roman banquet could quickly morph from a formal dinner to a forced theatrical performance. Picture Emperor Nero, a man who saw himself as the world's greatest artist, dressed as a performer, singing and playing the lyre before his nervous elite audience. The opulent banquet has transformed into a theatrical show where applause is mandatory for survival. For the traditional Roman aristocracy, it was considered utterly scandalous for a person of the elite class, let alone the emperor, to appear as a public entertainer, as these occupations were typically the domain of slaves, public performers, and infamous persons. To them, a Roman man was supposed to be a stoic, grave political and military leader, not a lyre-strumming showman. Nero's public performances were seen as an act of profound disgrace and effeminacy. Nero, however, was too fabulous, too self-obsessed, and too tyrannical to care about traditional Roman propriety. He saw his performances as a display of Greek-inspired culture and a legitimate expression of his power. a deliberate statement that the old ways of the Republic were dead. He wasn't content to simply win prizes for his poetry and lyre playing in public games. He brought the show directly to his elite guests, demanding a captive, appreciative audience. Imagine the sheer, agonizing awkwardness. The conversation stops, the wine stops flowing, and the emperor is suddenly dressed up in a costume, demanding rapt attention and thunderous praise for his musical talents, which were, by many accounts, distinctly mediocre. The audience reaction was critical. The emperor's performances were a massive test of loyalty and nerve. You had to pretend that Nero was the greatest talent the world had ever seen. The emperor's eye was sharp, and any sign of boredom, fatigue, or critical thought was a grave risk. Because it was forbidden to leave his performances, the resulting desperation was historically documented. The historian Suetonius records accounts of people being so desperate to escape they would fake their own deaths to be carried out of the theater. Pregnant women, one historian recorded, sometimes gave birth during the show because they couldn't be excused. The applause couldn't just be polite. It had to be enthusiastic, prolonged, and convincing. A physical and vocal commitment to the emperor's artistic genius. The political danger of being bored or seen as unappreciative was a fast track to ruin. Nero's performance wasn't a gift, it was a command. You sit there, trying to calculate the minimum acceptable volume of applause required for survival, all while your perfectly curated political network is disintegrating around you due to the sheer, suffocating absurdity of the situation. This isn't just dinner theater. It's an agonizing, high-stakes political performance where the price of a critical review is your life. A clear and terrifying reminder that the emperor's whim was the only law that mattered. Chapter 14. The Christian Allegory of Sin. Centuries after the empire's peak, later Christian writers began looking back at the Roman Empire's decline, creating a powerful allegory of sin and moral decay. A dramatic painting or literary work might show drunken senators and a collapsing moral order, transforming the historical feasts into a powerful warning against pagan excess. This is where the enduring image of the wild, unhinged Roman orgy found its permanent home in the Western imagination, turning history into a morality play. For these later Christian chroniclers and artists, the fall of Rome was fundamentally a moral, not just a military event. They viewed the empire as the ultimate example of what happens when a society is corrupted by wealth, paganism, and unrestrained physical indulgence. In short, the very opposite of Christian virtue. The existing extravagance of the Roman elite, which was already a major trope in late Republican and early imperial Roman historical writing, and condemned by conservative Romans themselves, was seized upon and weaponized. The real, calculated political dinners and refined demonstrations of wealth were twisted into something far more shocking, simplistic, and easily condemned. A world where gluttony, drunkenness, and sexual sin reigned supreme. The writers exaggerated the historical details, creating a vivid, almost cartoonish tableau of moral collapse. The Roman triclinium, already a symbol of luxury and elite power, became the setting for the ultimate pagan party, a space where discipline and virtue simply didn't exist. This served a clear, powerful, and didactic purpose for the emerging Christian world. It was a powerful, easily understood warning against the dangers of returning to the old pagan ways. It offered a neat, satisfying explanation for Rome's decline. They deserved it because they sinned. Why listen to subtle historical accounts of economic collapse or military overextension when you can show a painting of a fat, drunken senator vomiting into a golden bowl? The simple, visceral image of drunken excess was more persuasive than any historical document. This historical rebranding was a masterstroke of religious propaganda. The Christian writers successfully redefined the Roman feast from a strategic political gathering into a symbol of all pagan excess. The message was clear. If you indulge in these worldly, sinful delights, your civilization will collapse just like theirs did. It's a compelling, dramatic, and ultimately biased piece of historical revision, turning the subtle Roman political maneuverings into a simple, fiery lesson in consequence and redemption. The Roman feast, in the hands of Christian writers and artists, became a terrifying cautionary tale that resonated for centuries. Chapter 15. Dinner as a Power Flex. The Roman feast was ultimately not a wild party, but a hyper-formal expression of refinement and power. As silverware gleamed under candlelight, a host used imported spices and expensive dishes to subtly advertise his refinement and global power. This was a formal Roman banquet, unfolding with strict, almost suffocating etiquette in the triclinium. It was an event meticulously designed to enhance the owner's prestige and status. The food itself was the main vehicle for this power flex. The host's reputation rested on his ability to provide dishes that were not only delicious, but also rare, exotic, and prohibitively expensive, signaling his access to global trade networks. Every dish featuring spices from India, or exotic meats from Africa, or rare fish from the farthest reaches of the Mediterranean, was a statement that subtly screamed, "My wealth reaches further than yours." This wasn't merely about taste. It was about logistics, control, and economic dominance. The selection and preparation of the meal demonstrated both the host's cultural sophistication, his urbanitas, and his economic might. To serve a dish that was notoriously difficult or expensive to acquire was a silent, glittering advertisement of your ability to command the resources of the entire empire. Furthermore, the very act of inviting a guest was a carefully considered honor. Roman houses often had at least two triclinia, a triclinium maius, big dining room, for larger, more public parties, and smaller, more exclusive ones for intimate gatherings with a select group of favored guests. Being invited to the smaller, more elaborate dining room was an even greater symbol of favor and trust, a signal that you were truly part of the host's inner decision-making circle. The atmosphere was one of controlled luxury. While the food was rich and the wine flowed freely, there was little genuine drunken chaos, because the guests were, first and foremost, politicians and clients, performing their loyalty and angling for influence. The conversation was calculated, the seating was strategic, and the table manners were crucial. Any vulgarity, any lapse in etiquette, was a sign of a lack of gravitas and could be politically damaging. The highbrow dining entertainment, which often included recitations of epic literature or philosophical debate, further cemented the gathering's serious, dignified nature. The Roman feast was a 3-hour seminar in social climbing and strategic flattery, where you were subtly judging the host's wealth, and he was openly judging your loyalty, refinement, and political utility. It was the original working dinner, but with much more expensive tableware. Chapter 16. The Vikings' Living Archive. Let's cross the sea again, moving north to the world of the Vikings, where the cold air is matched only by the fierce loyalty of the Norse people. Here, the most valuable piece of art wasn't a carved wooden relic, but the very skin on your back. A Viking woman with striking deep blue and green markings stands proudly along the Volga River. For her, and her people, these intricate tattoos are not mere decoration, but a living testament to her clan, faith, and enduring identity. Her skin is a sacred space, a permanent, visible archive of her entire life, her heritage, and her relationship with the Norse cosmos. In the Viking Age, circa 793 to 1066 AD, runes were not merely an alphabet, they were powerful symbols carrying meanings that represented strength, protection, and wisdom. When these runes and symbols were permanently etched onto the body, they were seen as infusing the wearer with those qualities. This practice transformed the individual's skin into a portable, personal history that literally carried their achievements, their losses, and their sacred connections with them everywhere they traveled. A tattoo was a powerful statement of belonging, a visible identifier of one's clan and lineage, which was crucial in an era defined by long-distance travel, shifting alliances, and constant sudden danger. The body became a form of spiritual armor. The deep blue and green colors often associated with these markings, perhaps derived from soot, ground minerals, and plant pigments, would have made them incredibly striking and fearsome when seen on a warrior or trader. This was not subtle ink. It was a bold, intimidating display, often covering large areas of the face, arms, and torso. The markings publicly proclaimed the wearer's status, perhaps as a respected warrior, a revered spiritual leader, or a powerful merchant who had traveled the long-distance trade routes across the continent. The visible nature of the tattoo was a social language legible to every Norse person, instantly communicating a wealth of information about the person's history and loyalties. A Viking woman's tattoos could have symbolized her marriage, the successful voyages of her husband, her personal devotion to a specific deity like Odin, associated with wisdom, poetry, and war, or Thor, associated with physical strength and protection. The sheer permanence of the ink was a spiritual act. It was a personal promise that couldn't be broken, a history that couldn't be lost. In a culture with limited written records, the body became the most reliable and certainly the most public place to store your most important truths. It was a visual legacy, a profound connection to the spirits, and a constant visible reminder that you were a vital thread in the unfolding web of weird or fate. Chapter 17. Etched Loyalty and Eternal Journeys. The art of Viking tattoos. often simple yet profound knotwork designs, was an act of permanence and devotion. Etched onto a woman's forearm using a bronze needle and soot pigment, this permanent mark served as a living archive. It symbolized her family's long voyages, their history, and their eternal loyalty to one another. The popular knotwork designs, with their endless, interwoven lines, symbolize the interconnectedness of life and fate, the inescapable web of weird. The endless loop of the knotwork represented eternal loyalty and the continuous nature of time and destiny. A simple, beautifully composed pattern could be read by others as a complex story. A specific twist in the knot, or a tightly coiled spiral, might represent a family's success in trade, a victorious battle won by her kin, or a challenging journey to distant exotic lands like Miklagartha, Constantinople, or the eastern trade routes along the Volga. Because Viking society was highly mobile and spanned vast distances, the tattoos served as an instant, non-verbal ID. When a Viking trader arrived in a foreign port, their markings immediately communicated their identity, clan, and status in a way that language or changing clothing could not. This was essential for trade, forming quick alliances, and simply navigating a hostile, multi-ethnic world. The choice of location for the tattoo was also deeply meaningful. Placing a symbol on the forearm, as you see on this woman, was a powerful act. It was a part of the body that was constantly visible, particularly when handling a weapon, trading goods, or performing daily work. This visible placement ensured that the symbol's power, be it prosperity, fehu, strength, uruz, or guidance, was always active and on display. The act of getting the tattoo was a deliberate, painful ritual, a personal sacrifice to forge a permanent, visible bond between the individual and their community, their history, and their destiny. The pain was considered part of the ritual, proof of the wearer's commitment, and a way to focus the mind on the sacred nature of the symbol being inscribed. The tattoo wasn't just a record of the past. It was a powerful, active charm guiding the wearer toward a specific, desired future. Chapter 18. The Runic Shield of Protection. The marks on a Viking's skin weren't just about identity. They were about spiritual survival. Look closely at a woman's wrist, and you might see the runic symbol for algis, shaped like an upturned Y. This mark, often known as the elk rune, served as a potent spiritual shield, a piece of body armor offering protection against the unseen dangers and ill fortune of the world. In a time where life was brutal, violent, and defined by long, dangerous voyages across open water, the rune was a desperate, yet beautiful attempt to tip the scales of fate in one's favor. The Vikings lived in a world where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was thin, and they fully believed that an invisible, malicious force, a curse, a trick of the mischievous god Loki, or simple bad luck, could ruin a journey, a harvest, or a life. The tattoo was a counterspell made permanent. The Norse tradition incorporated a huge range of symbols for protection, each with a specific, powerful purpose. Besides algis, other common protective runes included uruz, symbolizing physical and mental strength, and the untamed power of the aurochs, a wild ox, often used to protect health and vitality. Then there was thurisaz, which could symbolize the defensive power of the giants, often acting as a painful, proactive defense against one's enemies, like a thorn waiting to strike. But the spiritual defense didn't stop at single runes. You might often see a bind rune, which is a combination of several runes woven together into a single complex sign, worn on the wrist or ankle for continuous, multi-layered strength and defense. These custom, powerful combinations created a personalized, high-density layer of magical protection, tailored precisely to the wearer's greatest fears, be it drowning at sea, betrayal by a comrade, or simple illness. The bind rune was the ultimate, personalized medieval software patch against the cosmic bugs of fate. The concept was simple but profound. If a physical shield of wood and iron could protect you from a sword, a runic symbol, a sacred cosmic inscription, could protect you from ill luck, sickness, and vengeful spirits. Tattooing these runes onto the body was an act of proactive magic, permanently embedding good fortune, or, more accurately, defensive power into the very flesh. The practice was so embedded that other forms of magical talismans, like the Icelandic magical staves, also found their way onto Viking skin. The Helm of Or, Egishjalma, a terrifying symbol designed to instill fear and grant the wearer courage. Or the runic compass, Vegvisir, a protective talisman for travelers that ensured one would never lose their way, were often tattooed as functional, permanent body armor. These were not just drawings. They were active, defensive spells, a constant plea for good fortune, etched right into your personal survival toolkit. When a warrior faced a terrifying enemy or a sailor faced a monstrous storm, the symbol on their wrist wasn't just a memory. It was a perceived source of active, spiritual energy channeled from the gods themselves. This belief system transformed the skin into a canvas of spiritual armor, a powerful, permanent defense against a hostile world. The pain and permanence of the tattoo served as a continuous sacrifice, ensuring the gods heard the plea and the magic remained potent. You're not just wearing a piece of art. You're wearing an unbreakable mystical contract with the forces that govern the cosmos. Chapter 19. The Ritual of the Needle. The process of getting a Viking tattoo was far more than a simple appointment. It was a deep, sacred ritual. The respected tattooist was often part healer and part priest, carefully tapping pigment into the skin with a sharpened bone needle. This ritual wasn't just about art. It was about binding body and spirit to the sacred cycles of Norse belief, making a permanent connection to the divine. This was a practice rooted in Nordic pagan esoteric religion, an act of profound spiritual commitment that lasted for hours or even days, ensuring the spiritual safety of the recipient. The tools themselves were rudimentary and painful. Sharpened bone needles or bronze implements used to tap the soot and pigment mixture into the skin, one precise tap at a time. The pigment itself was often a dark, rich mixture of soot, perhaps mixed with fats or plant matter, to create the deep blues and greens historically noted in accounts. The pain was an intrinsic and necessary part of the process, a personal sacrifice that imbued the resulting mark with spiritual strength and meaning. This wasn't something you did on a whim. It required deliberate intent, great courage, and a profound understanding of the Futhark runes and their magical meanings. The tattooist was no mere artist. They were a figure of wisdom and spiritual authority, often acting as an intermediary between the mundane world and the Norse pantheon. They ensured the correct runes were applied in the correct sequence to achieve the desired effect, be it protection from illness, success in battle, or guidance on a voyage. The tattooist didn't just pierce the skin. They were believed to be literally infusing the person with the power of the symbols, a process that required chanting, ritualistic music, or the reciting of Eddic poetry to focus the magical energy. This meticulous, sacred process ensured the mark was a true Galdrostafur, a magic stave, rather than just a decoration. The ceremony often involved chanting or ritualistic practices to honor the Norse gods, like Odin, who was associated with runes and wisdom, and Freya, associated with love, fertility, and magic. The completion of the tattoo was a massive event, a permanent contract with the divine, a literal, physical manifestation of the wearer's fate and faith. It was a profound act of self-definition, a way to permanently secure your place within the cosmic order as a true Norse believer. The seriousness of the ink meant that its permanence was understood to follow the individual even after death, signifying their identity and faith when they journeyed to the halls of the gods. In a culture obsessed with honor and legacy, the permanent, painful tattoo was the most unbreakable oath one could make, binding the body and the spirit to the sacred cycles of life, death, and destiny. You're not just getting ink, you're engaging in a sacred, profound act of pain and magic.
Chapter 20. The Illyrian King's Defiance.
Now, let's step back into the ancient world, to the sun-drenched, rugged coast of the Adriatic around the 2nd century BC. Our attention falls on the formidable King Gentius of the Labiates, who stands at his capital, Skadra, modern Shkodër, Albania, a symbol of defiance and ambition against the most powerful entity in the Mediterranean, Rome. Gentius was the last independent ruler of the Illyrian kingdom, and his mission was to unify the fiercely independent Illyrian tribes into a single disciplined power, creating a shield against the looming, unstoppable shadow of the Roman Republic. Gentius ascended to the throne around 181 BC, succeeding his father Pleuratus III, and inherited a kingdom already fragmented and under immense pressure. The Illyrian kingdom, which encompassed the Western Balkans, was geographically and ethnically diverse, making unity a constant struggle. Coastal cities like Apollonia and Dyrrhachium, valuable ports on the trade routes, were already allied with Rome, serving as Roman strongholds on his borders. Moreover, even key Illyrian tribes like the Dalmatii and Deorsi had declared their independence early in his reign, weakening his base of power. Rome, ever expanding, viewed the entire Illyrian coast as strategically vital for controlling the Adriatic and ensuring the smooth passage of its troops and trade vessels to Greece. They were constantly irritated by the Illyrians' strength in the navy and its interference with Adriatic shipping, often labeling their activities as piracy to justify military intervention. Gentius understood the gravity of the situation. To survive, he had to stop the internal feuding and build a single, formidable state capable of organized warfare. His capital, Skadra, became the epicenter of this desperate unification effort, turning the city into a hive of diplomatic and military activity. Gentius attempted to consolidate power over the tribes north and west of the Roman-controlled area, even forming marriage alliances, such as marrying Etuta, the daughter of the Dardanian king Monunius II, to strengthen his regional ties. His strategy was a high-stakes gamble. Unify his people, build up his naval power, the Illyrian lembi were fast, effective warships, and secure external alliances, namely with Perseus of Macedon, to create a counterweight to Roman influence in the region. This defiance wasn't just a political stance, it was a last-ditch effort to save a culture from being swallowed whole by the Roman Republic. He saw the systematic, methodical advance of Roman power and recognized that neutrality was no longer an option. His challenge was immense, transforming a nation of fierce, individualistic coastal raiders into a unified, disciplined army capable of standing against the legendary Roman legions. It was a race against time, a furious push to consolidate power and gather supplies, while the silent, unforgiving shadow of Rome crept ever closer.
Up the coast. Chapter 21. Preparing for the inevitable storm. The Illyrian capital, Scadra, is a hive of wary activity. Warriors hardened by a lifetime of coastal raids gather and train. Blacksmiths are working day and night to reforge broken weapons, and King Gentius, aware of his fragile alliances, prepares his navy and forces for an inevitable, brutal war with Rome. The looming conflict was the Third Illyrian War, 168 BC, and Gentius had already made his fatal commitment. He publicly changed his alliance from Rome to Perseus of Macedon in 169 BC, throwing his lot in with Rome's most formidable eastern enemy. This move was his point of no return, a definitive challenge to the Republic. The city of Scadra became a focal point for this desperate military preparation. The warriors gathering there, while fierce and effective in their traditional coastal raiding vessels, lembi, were now preparing to face the disciplined, large-scale infantry of the Roman legions. Gentius doubled down on his aggression to prove his commitment to Perseus and to galvanize his own people. He arrested 2 Roman envoys, legati, accusing them of being spies, and swiftly destroyed the cities of Apollonia and Dyrrachium, which were fiercely loyal to Rome. These were defiant, calculated moves intended to provoke the war on his terms, or at least on his territory. However, the Illyrian strength, which lay primarily in their navy and the mobility of their raiding parties, was not enough to counter the legionary advance on land. Gentius had to quickly adapt his forces from maritime raiders to a land-based army capable of defending a fixed large position like Scadra. The forging of weapons, the stockpiling of supplies, and the construction of siege defenses in Scadra was an urgent, frantic effort to shore up a defense that was ultimately reliant on a promise from an ally far to the east. Illyrian warriors, accustomed to quick surgical raids, now had to learn the grim, necessary art of standing shoulder to shoulder in a long, drawn-out siege. The energy in Scadra would have been a palpable mix of defiance, fear, and grim determination. Every person in the capital, from the king to the humblest blacksmith, knew they were standing on the precipice of a war that would determine the fate of their culture. Gentius was desperate, committing acts of aggression that guaranteed Roman reprisal, all while clinging to the hope that Macedonian gold and troops would arrive to make his sacrifice worthwhile. The preparations were massive, but beneath the noise of the hammers and the shouts of the drilling warriors, there was the unsettling silence of a nation holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm to break. Chapter 22. Betrayal and Isolation. King Gentius stands alone, his face grim, as the terrible realization sets in. The promised gold and crucial reinforcements from his supposed ally, Macedon's Perseus, will not arrive. He is exposed, isolated, a single flickering flame of resistance as the disciplined, overwhelming Roman legions begin their methodical advance up the rugged Illyrian coast. The alliance that Gentius had gambled his entire kingdom on, the one that caused him to arrest the Roman envoys and attack Roman-allied cities, had dissolved. The Macedonian gold, promised to fund the Illyrian war effort, never materialized, and the troops remained static. Perseus, fearing the Romans even more than he feared Gentius, chose to prioritize his own defense, leaving the Illyrian king exposed and alone to face the full wrath of the Republic. This betrayal and isolation was the final crippling blow. Gentius was left facing the full might of the Roman Republic entirely on his own, having executed highly provocative acts that guaranteed a Roman response that would be swift and overwhelming. The Romans, under the command of L. Anicius Gallus, moved quickly and efficiently, deploying a force that was superior in both numbers and logistics. The Romans understood the strategic geography perfectly. They knew how to fight the Illyrians from decades of previous conflicts, and understood the importance of separating Gentius from his potential allies and supply lines. The methodical Roman advance, a tide of disciplined soldiers and engineers, quickly rendered the Illyrian forces defensive, forcing Gentius to abandon the field and retreat to his capital at Scadra. King Gentius, the proud unifier, was now a king marooned, standing exposed to the full, terrifying might of Rome, having been completely abandoned by his supposed partners. This moment is a profound political tragedy. A leader who correctly identified the existential threat and chose a path of aggressive resistance, only to be betrayed and abandoned by the very people he hoped would join his desperate cause. His defiance, which had burned so brightly, now seemed merely reckless. His only remaining choice was to retreat to his stronghold at Scadra and prepare for a siege against an enemy that outnumbered and outsupplied him in every conceivable way. The disciplined Roman approach, methodical and unforgiving, was now marching up the coast, ready to extinguish the last vestiges of Illyrian independence. The weight of his isolated decision, now clearly a fatal error, must have been crushing as he prepared for the siege. Chapter 23. The Grim End of the Siege. The Roman legions, disciplined and methodical, have finally descended, surrounding the Illyrian stronghold of Scadra. Illyrian archers fire desperately from the walls, but the river is cut off and supplies dwindle, leading to the grim end of the siege. The Roman commander, L. Anicius Gallus, prosecuted the war with ruthless speed and devastating efficiency, defeating Gentius in a campaign that lasted a mere 20 or 30 days in 168 BC, an astoundingly short time to defeat a king and secure his capital. The siege of Scadra was a textbook display of Roman military superiority and strategic patience. Gallus did not rely on messy, costly frontal assaults.
He knew the Illyrians were fierce when cornered. Instead, he employed the classic strategy of containment and attrition. By surrounding the city and cutting off its supply lines, particularly access to fresh water from the important river supply, the Romans simply waited for starvation and thirst to do the heavy lifting. Roman engineers were experts at diverting waterways and building circumvallation lines to completely isolate a fortress, turning the defensive walls into a prison. The Illyrian archers, firing from the walls, could harass the Romans, but they could not break the siege lines, which were constructed with speed and skill. Inside Skadra, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Food supplies, never ample for a large population under siege, quickly ran low. The desperate hope of Macedonian relief, the entire reason for their fight, faded with each passing day. The discipline and patient organization of the Roman legions proved to be the decisive factor, wearing down the morale and physical strength of the Illyrian defenders. The Illyrians, traditionally masters of the quick raid, were simply not equipped to sustain a prolonged siege against an opponent with limitless resources and unflinching resolve. Gentius, witnessing the increasing suffering of his people and the ultimate futility of further resistance, was faced with an impossible choice: continue the hopeless fight and watch his capital starve, or surrender to save his people. The overwhelming power of Rome, combined with the lack of relief, sealed the fate of the last independent Illyrian kingdom. Chapter 24. The Dignified Surrender. The moment of total defeat arrives, but not without dignity. Wearing his royal robes, King Gentius stands with unwavering composure before the Roman general Lucius Anicius Gallus, a dignified, defeated monarch, surrendering his sword and his kingdom in full. The surrender was the final, most solemn piece of political theater. Gentius, defeated but visibly unbowed, walked out of Skadra to face his conqueror. This act of dignified surrender was a desperate final attempt to preserve the honor of his people and to secure a better, or at least less brutal, fate for himself and his family. He offered no pleas, no groveling, but a formal, composed capitulation that acknowledged Roman victory while still asserting his own royal status. It was a silent demonstration that the Illyrian king may have lost the war, but he had not lost his personal pride or courage. He was a defeated king, but he was not a broken man. The Roman commander Gallus accepted the surrender of the king, his wife Atuta, and his family, taking them captive immediately. This capture was highly significant for Rome. Gentius was not executed. He was a valuable prize, a living trophy whose public humiliation would serve as a profound message to any other defiant peoples. His surrender marked the end of the independent Illyrian kingdom. The Romans quickly split the region into 3 administrative divisions to prevent any future unified resistance, officially incorporating the fiercely independent Illyrian lands into the growing sphere of the Roman Republic. Gentius's last official duty as king would be a terrifying and deeply humiliating one: to walk in chains as a spectacle in the conqueror's military parade. The very composure he maintained during his surrender was his final act of defiance, a demonstration that while his freedom was gone, his spirit remained unbroken. Chapter 25.
a legacy of unbroken spirit. King Gentius and his family are paraded in chains through the streets of Rome, a living trophy in the conqueror's triumph. Crowds cheer and jeer at the sight of the last fallen Illyrian royalty. The triumph of Lucius Anicius Gallus over King Gentius and the Illyrians was a massive days-long spectacle designed to celebrate the end of the war and the expansion of the Republic's dominion. The sight of the defeated king, a symbol of resistance, was the ultimate visceral proof of Rome's total domination. After the parade, Gentius was exiled and interned in the Italian town of Iguvium, where he lived out the remainder of his days. The goal of the triumph was to utterly erase the memory of the Illyrian kingdom as a sovereign entity. Yet centuries later, the spirit of resistance endures. The Illyrian people, once considered fragmented tribes, were not simply erased. They were, in a historical twist of fate, integrated into the vast fabric of the Roman Empire. Their descendants would carry the heritage of the fallen kingdom right to the top of the conqueror's hierarchy. In fact, a significant number of future Roman emperors would emerge from the former Illyrian lands. These Illyrian emperors, men like Diocletian, Claudius Gothicus, and Constantine the Great, were highly capable, often formidable rulers who rose through the ranks of the disciplined Roman military, and were instrumental in saving and reshaping the Roman Empire centuries later. The fierce culture and independence of the Illyrian people, carved into the mountains and remembered in their songs, refused to die. The defeat of Gentius in 168 BC was the end of a kingdom, but the beginning of a legacy of resilience that would ultimately be carried in the blood of the very empire that conquered them. Their spirit, forged in the brutal hills and the cold waters of the Adriatic, found its final, profound expression not in defeat, but in becoming the dominant political and military force within the Roman state's final centuries. The lineage of the proud unified tribes never truly died. It simply took on a new, more powerful form within the structure of the conqueror. King Gentius was gone, but the spirit of Illyria endured, a powerful reminder that conquest is rarely total, and that the descendants of the defeated can often rise to rule their former masters. The history of the Illyrian kings is a quiet, powerful testament to the enduring power of a fierce, stubborn identity. And so we leave the cold, dark stone of the medieval castle, the tense, calculated atmosphere of the Roman banquet, and the defeated dignity of the Illyrian king. We've seen that true power isn't just about stone. It's about a hill of dirt or a simple clockwise staircase, a tiny architectural joke that buys you precious time. We've learned that a Viking woman's tattoo was a map of her soul and destiny, a spiritual shield etched in her skin that traveled with her on every journey. And we realized that Roman high society was less a party and more a deadly, calculated political seminar, where every bite and every nervous compliment was a move in the game of empire. The people of the past didn't have our comforts, but they had an unbreakable, stubborn ingenuity. They turned their fear into fortress, their skin into art, and their dinner parties into high-stakes theatre. They endured the cold of stone walls, the paranoia of imperial rule, and the pain of ultimate betrayal. They pressed on, making profound, high-risk choices, like King Gentius, who gambled everything on a fragile alliance, and the castle builders, who spent a decade building a monument to their own fear. So tonight, as you tuck into your clean, warm bed, maybe whisper a quiet thank you to your ancestors. Thank them for the double-paned windows that keep the wind out, for the hot water that washes away the smell of the day, and for the fact that your dinner party doesn't require you to enthusiastically applaud a slightly unhinged emperor playing the lyre. History may be brutal and utterly demanding, but it's also proof that people are fiercely resilient, endlessly creative, and always, always driven by something far greater than comfort. Rest well, and dream of dirt mountains and dignified kings.